Have you ever entered a room and felt yourself change just before anyone asked you to? Like your voice adjusts, your body becomes more careful, your expression becomes more measured. Your truth, your truth begins looking for the safest way to remain acceptable. Not because someone threatened you, no. Not because someone said, be smaller. Not because the room was openly hostile. But because something inside you started reading the atmosphere before allowing you to fully arrive. Perhaps you called it manners. Perhaps you called it emotional intelligence. Perhaps you called it maturity. Perhaps you called it knowing how to behave. And sometimes it was, but not always, surely. This is not a message about politeness. This is a message about presence. And there is a difference, a subtle one, a costly one. A difference many people do not notice until they feel exhausted. Exhausted from being acceptable everywhere and fully present nowhere. You see, self-editing rarely begins with words. It begins earlier. It begins before the sentence, before the gesture, before the opinion, before the laugh, before the truth leaves the body. A person fills the room first. They scan for the temperature. They measure the mood. They calculate what might disturb the peace. They sense what version of themselves will be easiest to receive. And then, without drama, without announcement, without anyone noticing, presence begins turning into performance. And I am not referring to theatrical performance, no. I'm referring to a subtle one, a survival mode one. The performance of being safe to receive. You see, there is a version of you that knows how to enter rooms beautifully. It smiles at the right moment. It speaks with the right tone. It chooses the safest words. It gives enough truth to appear honest, but not enough truth to risk consequence. This version of you can look, let's say, impressive, composed, pleasant, reasonable, even socially intelligent. But sometimes beneath all that polish, there is absence. Not failure, no. Absence. Yes, you are in the room. You are speaking, yes. You are participating, yes, of course. You are being received, yes, indeed you are. But something essential has remained outside the door. Something true, something alive, something unedited. Self-editing is not stupidity. It's not weakness. It's not even moral failure. No. Mhm. Often self-editing is intelligence that learned too early that expression could create consequence. Picture a child, if you please. Because a child learns very quickly, okay? They learn which tone created tension. They learn which truth creates withdrawal. They learn which desire receives disapproval. They learn which expression becomes too much. They learn which silence keeps the room calm. Before many people learn how to be themselves, they learn how to be manageable. Manageable for family, manageable for school, manageable for culture, manageable for the room, manageable for love. And often the strategy works. The edited child receives less criticism, less conflict, less rejection, less exposure, even less danger. And because the strategy works, the nervous system remembers it. The difficulty begins when the strategy remains after the season has changed. Because the person grows older, the room changes. The danger may no longer be the same. But the body still behaves as though expression must pass through inspection before it may enter the world. And so the individual enters new relationships, new opportunities, new friendships, new stages of visibility, but carries an old internal instruction that says, check first, adjust first, do not disturb, do not risk too much of yourself. And slowly, the past becomes the editor of the present. This does not happen visibly, does not happen consciously. It happens powerfully. You see, a person begins living as though every room still has authority over how much of them is allowed to exist. There is nothing wrong with being aware of a room. Awareness is useful, yes. Awareness is part of maturity, yes. Awareness allows discernment, timing, respect, and emotional intelligence, yes. But awareness becomes dangerous when it turns into surveillance. When you are no longer simply noticing, you are monitoring. When you are no longer simply discerning, because you are managing. When you are no longer simply choosing words, because you are protecting yourself from being fully known. And eventually, Eventually, the inner observer becomes the inner sensor. It interrupts expression. It corrects aliveness. It questions natural movement. It examines desire before desire has permission to breathe. Was that too much? Did I say something wrong? Did they misunderstand me? Should I have smiled more? Should I have said less? Should I have been easier? That is not presence, no. That is internal labor. And many people are tired, not because they lack energy, but because they are carrying an invisible editing inside themselves. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes from constant acceptability. Not from work, not from responsibility, not from ordinary social life, but from having to translate yourself before anyone meets you. A version for family, a version for friends, a version for work, a version for visibility, a version for love, a version for people who might not understand, a version for people whose approval still carries weight. And after a while, a person does not feel like one coherent self. They feel like a collection of, say, adaptations, a careful arrangement of versions, each one version designed to keep belonging from collapsing. But connection built upon constant translation is not full connection, no. It is negotiation. And negotiation, when it becomes the price of presence, eventually exhausts the soul. One of the most painful parts of self-editing is that it can be rewarded. People may praise you for the very version of yourself that costs you presence. They may call you kind, mature, easy, professional, composed, strong. And because the edited version is loved, the unedited self begins wondering whether it is safe to appear at all. That is a quiet wound. This happens not because people are necessarily cruel, no. This happens because approval can become, say, confusing when it attaches itself to your disappearance. A person begins asking, do they love me? Or do they love the version of me that never asks for too much? Complicated question. The version of me that never disrupts the room, is that the version that they love. The version of me that never reveals the full temperature of what is true. And this is precisely where the distinction matters. Because acceptance is not always belonging. Sometimes acceptance means you may stay if you remain edited. Whereas belonging says you may remain present. And believe me, if you will, there is a world between those two. Self-editing is not random. No, it protects against something. Against disappointment, against rejection, against being judged, against being misunderstood, against becoming too visible, against finding out that the room cannot hold the truth of you. That is often the fear beneath the edit. It is not simply, what if I am rejected? But what if my truth changes the room? Harsh. What if the tone changes? What if the warmth disappears? What if I become difficult to love? What if the version of me that is real costs more than the version of me that is acceptable? So the person edits. The person edits not because they have no truth. No. The person edits because they understand consequence. And they understand consequence sometimes too well. And when consequence has been studied for long enough, truth can begin feeling dangerous. Even in rooms where it is no longer forbidden. Controlled presence can look elegant. It can look calm. It can look refined. It can look impressive even. But controlled presence is not always sovereign presence. Sometimes controlled presence is fear wearing beautiful posture. There is a stillness that comes from wisdom. And there is a stillness that comes from withholding. There is restraint that preserves dignity. And there is restraint that prevents embodiment. From the outside, they may look similar. Yes, they may. But internally, they feel entirely different. You see, one is chosen, the other is enforced. One comes from command, the other comes from fear. One says, this is not the moment. whereas the other says it is not safe to be fully here. And that distinction matters. Because PrinceOS does not teach people to spill themselves everywhere. It teaches orientation. It teaches that presence does not mean that every truth belongs in every room. But it does mean you are not internally exiled before the room has even met you. Because presence is not exposure. Presence is not oversharing. Presence is not emotional flooding. Presence is not telling everyone everything. Presence is not rebellion against all social intelligence. No. That would be another distortion. Presence is internal permission. The permission to remain connected to what is true in you, even when you choose how, when, where, and with whom to express it. And that is very different. Discernment chooses. Fear edits. Discernment says, this truth is real, and I will place it wisely. On the other hand, fear says, this truth is dangerous, so I must make it smaller before anyone sees it. You see, the question is not, did I say everything? The real question is, did I remain connected to myself while deciding what to say? That question alone reveals the difference between sovereignty and self-erasure. Because the body often knows when present has become self-editing. You see, the jaw tightens. The breath becomes shallow. The chest narrows. The stomach holds. The smile lasts longer than the truth behind it. You may explain it beautifully afterwards. Yes. You may call it wisdom, of course. You may call it keeping the peace, whatever. But the body records the compromise. Quietly, precisely, without needing your permission. This is why certain conversations leave people tired even when nothing dramatic happened. No argument, no conflict, no obvious wound. Just the residue of having edited themselves into acceptability again. And they may say, I do not know why I feel strange. But in reality, something in them knows. You see, nothing happens outwardly, no. But inwardly, something left. Some part of them was asked to wait outside once again. The issue is not one, no. The issue is the pattern. One edited sentence may not matter. One adjusted tone may not matter. One swallowed truth may not matter. But repetition, repetition changes identity. A person begins to experience themselves as naturally quiet, naturally agreeable, naturally detached, naturally composed, naturally easy. But sometimes that is not nature. No. Sometimes that is training. And then the deeper question becomes, who were you before the edit becomes automatic? Who were you before the room arrived first? Who were you before belonging required translation? Who were you before expression had to prove it would not create consequence? These questions are not sentimental, no. These questions are structural. Because if the edit was learned, then presence can be recovered. Not instantly, not performatively, no, but consciously. Presence begins returning when a person starts noticing the edit without attacking themselves for it. And that matters, okay? Because the goal is not to shame the strategy, no. Because the strategy may have protected you. The strategy may have helped you survive. The strategy may have carried you through rooms where truth was not safe. So yes, gratitude, respect, understanding. Yes, but not authorship. The strategy can be thanked, yes, but it can be thanked without being allowed to govern the rest of your life. The simple question begins the return. And that question is, am I choosing or am I shrinking? Another question is, am I being discerning or am I disappearing? And yet another, am I silent because it is wise or because I am afraid to disturb the image they have of me? The return begins there. Not with dramatic declarations, not with sudden rebellion, no. not with forcing yourself to become louder than your nature. No. The return begins with honest internal distinction. Some people believe that recovering presence means becoming louder, more confrontational, more exposed, more intense. But that is not always true. Sometimes the return to presence is very quiet. It's one honest question, one real preference, one boundary spoken without apology, one pause before agreeing, one moment where the body does not abandon itself to keep the room comfortable. Because the goal is not louder, no. The goal is truer, not dramatic, not reckless, not performative, no, none. Truer. Because presence does not need to become noisy in order to become real. A sovereign presence does not beg to be accepted. It does not attack the room. It does not perform indifference. It does not collapse into approval. No. A sovereign presence remains connected to what is true and then chooses its expression with dignity. The room may influence expression, and that is maturity. The room may require timing, and that is discernment. The room may not deserve full access. That is wisdom. But the room must not decide whether you exist. Your center is not a public vote. Your presence is not a committee decision. Your truth does not become real only when the room approves its tone. A person can be respectful without becoming erased. Remember this: respect is not disappearance. Kindness is not self-erasure. Maturity is not constant emotional translation. And belonging is not proven by the ability to become easy at your own expense. Do not confuse peace with absence. A quiet room is not always a healthy room. Sometimes it is quiet because everyone is present. Sometimes it is quiet because someone has learned to disappear beautifully. Presence requires courage. I'm not talking about the theatrical kind, no. I'm not talking about the kind that needs applause, no. I'm talking about a quieter courage. The courage to let your truth remain alive inside you even when the old reflex wants to edit into safety. The courage to remain connected, to remain embodied, to remain honest, to remain internally loyal to the self that spent too long waiting for permission. And yes, this may reveal something difficult, that not every room can hold you. Not every relationship can receive you. Not every audience will understand you. Not every environment deserves the full weight of your presence. But that is information, not condemnation, not drama, not rejection as identity, no. Simply information. A sovereign does not need every room to become home. A sovereign needs enough orientation to know where he is no longer required to abandon itself. When presence becomes self-editing, the self waits outside. The person enters, the performance enters, the acceptable version enters. But the real self remains at the threshold, wondering whether this room is safe enough to be met. That is the cost. Not merely tiredness, not merely frustration, not merely social discomfort. The cost is living in constant proximity to yourself without full inhabitation of it. But the return is possible, not by attacking the strategy, not by forcing exposure, no, not by becoming hard, not by becoming cold, no, by noticing, by distinguishing, by choosing, by allowing presence to become less edited and more governed. Less edited, more governed. Less translated, more embodied. Less acceptable at the cost of truth. More present, even when expression must remain wise. You are not here to become acceptable everywhere. No. You are not here to spend your life translating your existence into versions that disturb no one. No. You are not here to be praised for the elegance of your disappearance. You are here to become present, not careless, not cruel, not exposed everywhere. No. Simply present. Connected to what is true. Able to choose expression without abandoning existence. Presence is not performance. Presence is not constant acceptability. Presence is not the edited version being uploaded by rooms that never met the real person. No. Presence is the return of internal permission. The room may receive you. The room may misunderstand you. The room may not be ready for you, but the room must not write you. The room must not become the author of how much of your truth is allowed to breathe. And for those who require positioning beyond what is shared here, there are forms of work not conducted in public. Access exists. Remember this. The version of you that kept the room comfortable may not be the version of you that can carry your life forward. Do not confuse self-control with self-erasure. Do not confuse discernment with disappearance. Do not let the edit become your identity. Because at some point, life stops asking, how can I remain acceptable? At some point, life begins asking, can I finally remain present? And that question alone marks the next stage of embodiment.